Photos of drowned Syrian toddler Alan Kurdi have shocked people around the globe. Now many are wondering if it's time for Canada to do more to help the world's displaced people, and which federal party is the best to do that. Joining us now for more on how this is affecting our federal election, in Kingston, Ontario, Christian Leuprecht. He is political scientist at the Royal Military College of Canada. And with us here in studio, Janice Stein, TVO's foreign affairs analyst and founding director of the Monk School for Global Affairs. Francisco Rico Martinez, co-director of the FCJ Refugee Center, and Alexandra Kotek, project manager of Lifeline Syria. Christian, good to have you on the line from Kingston, and to the three of you here in the studio, I appreciate your being with us on such short notice today. I want to start by just going through three charts here, which will help set the scene for our discussion. So, Mr. Director, if you would please, these are forcibly displaced people in the world. You see they're broken down into three different categories: internally displaced persons, refugees, and asylum seekers. And as you go across the chart, you can see how the chart spikes for the Rwandan genocide, the war in Afghanistan again, and then as we get to 2014, you see the impact of the Syrian civil war. A couple of more charts to help reinforce these points. Here's refugees by country of origin. In the year 2014, no surprise, Syria #1, Afghanistan #2, and then a big drop-off after that. And one more chart, refugees by country of destination. Where are they going? Well, given what's happening in Syria and its proximity to Turkey, you won't be surprised to see Turkey is the #1 destination. Pakistan, the #1 destination for Afghan refugees. And then again, Lebanon, Iran, and it tails off. I want to start with a bit of an odd question because I have heard, Francisco, to you first. I've heard these people who we're talking about today referred to in many different ways. What do we call them?
I call them refugees, and I am using the Canadian definition of people in need of protection to do that. We have one of the most expanded definitions. We have the convention, the Refugee Convention definition. We have the people that are at risk to be tortured, and people that their life is at risk. We have these three elements in our definition. So I call it refugees, and I call it refugees as well because the general risk that they are facing, is clearly, you can see it every day. And the last point is there is mixed flows, of course. There is refugees, there is migrants, there is many things. And we have been dealing with these mixed flows since the beginning of our work here 100 years ago.
Well, let me go to Christian on that. Again, we've heard the term asylum seekers, we've heard migrants, we hear refugees. Is there one term that you think is best to use over the others?
Well, I think in Canada we talk about refugees because 95% of people who show up in Canada are people that Canada has already pre-selected in one way or another. So there's very few people who just kind of show up, whereas in Europe we have the exact opposite. Most of the people who show up in Europe just kind of show up on their borders. And so we think of this general category of refugees, whereas in Europe we think a lot more of asylum seekers, people who seek temporary refuge. And we know from the Balkan Wars that the bulk of people who come end up returning to their own countries once some sense of stability has returned.
Janice, are you prepared to say that what is happening in the world today, vis-a-vis the people we're talking about, is a full-blown crisis?
I certainly am, Steve, and really it's the largest crisis of this sort that we've seen since World War II. And that's what makes it so challenging for everybody to deal with. Why do I say the largest since World War II? There is no limit to the number of people who would choose to move out of the Middle East right now because of violence and fear of violence.
Nobody wants to stay.
Well,
almost nobody wants to stay.
We are getting a huge upsurge right now from Iraq as they see Syrian refugees successfully gain admission into Europe. So there are no boundaries around this problem, unlike what we had in those earlier charts in Rwanda and in Vietnam when we took boat people from Vietnam. That makes it an enormous humanitarian crisis, which it is, but a huge policy challenge as well.
Alexandra, I suspect some people are wondering, this Syrian civil war has been going on for 4 years. This phenomenon that's happening right now, this crisis, is, it's very recent. Why the uptick all of a sudden?
Well, I think that we have seen a huge increase. If you looked at the refugees you showed as the second largest group was Afghans, but it was more of a slow movement, and they'd been sitting at #1 for quite a long time. And the Syrian crisis seems to have revved up extraordinarily fast. And so people, I think, knew of other refugee populations, were worried about other refugee populations, and weren't really aware of how quickly and how devastating the Syrian crisis was.
I might just want to add one thing to what Alexander said. What we haven't talked about, Steve, are the number of neighboring countries in the Middle East who have taken refugees. So Jordan's at capacity.
Jordan's been overrun.
It's overrun. Turkey, frankly, Turkey is staggering under this, and its politics are staggering under this. So as you exhaust the near border state capacity to take refugees, that's when you see the groundswell that you're seeing now.
We are not only talking about the full capacity by the government or by the state. We are talking about the civil society that have been swamped, you know, and they are responding to this with whatever they have. So in that case, we are in front of a crisis for sure.
Yeah.
The long list of countries here and the high numbers of people who are trying to get out of countries and move to other countries, is this a sign that the world as a whole is particularly unstable right now?
I think you're seeing that populations that weren't able to go home. I mean, when you talk about the end of the Second World War, people were able to go home, or they were able to be integrated into the countries that they found refuge in. And as these conflicts stay protracted, with the Somali population, for instance, being the third group, that's been going on for years now. And so, you know, when you have then mix of Iraqis and Syrians, and the stability in those countries has never stabilized. So I don't know where people would go. So they obviously, as was mentioned by others, you know, they're staying in these countries that can't host them, and then they don't see any other option. That's why they end up fleeing to Europe.
Janice, if you look at graphic number 2 again, Afghanistan is number 2. Does that mean that since the Canadian troops left, the place has fallen apart and nobody can go home or nobody feels safe there anymore?
I certainly think the trajectory in Afghanistan is downward. Despite years and years and years of Herculean effort, it is downward, and the violence is growing. So look at the 2 largest sources right now, Steve, that you showed us.
Syria and Afghanistan.
Syria and Afghanistan. Violent civil wars going on in both for a protracted period of time. So yes, uptick is just catching people's attention now, but frankly, it's no surprise. You have a part of the world right now, the Middle East, where political order is breaking down, and you have collapsed states. We're beyond failing states. We're into collapsed states. It's these kinds of environments that generate flows on this order of magnitude, with no end in sight, by the way.
We tried,
no end.
No end in sight. We tried, we meaning our military, tried to bring some stability to the situation in Afghanistan. Our military's not there anymore, and you're saying Afghanistan's now falling apart. Is that to suggest there's no military solution for whatever's happening right now?
You know, that's a black and white statement. There's no military solution. So let's put a little gray in it.
Okay.
Because the situations are different, obviously. The obvious one is Syria and Iraq, where there were multiple destabilizers. In Syria, there are 2 big ones right now. The government itself, President Bashar al-Assad, who has attacked his own population relentlessly, and ISIS. And everybody's struggling. How do you deal with these 2 at the same time? Because when you go after one, you empower the other one. That's what makes it so difficult. The fact that Europe, Canada, the United States have stopped the spread of ISIS to other areas is a good thing, because we would, in fact, if they hadn't, we would have larger numbers. But is that the answer? No, certainly not.
Let me go to Christian with a follow-up on that, because clearly the world is coming together in a way right now to consider a humanitarian response to what's going on in Syria. But Christian, you're at the Royal Military College, so I want to call on your military expertise in asking whether you think there is a military solution to what we're seeing right now.
Well, inherently the military solution has at least somewhat helped to contain the spread of the conflict. And I think that's one thing certainly that the West can do with some military intervention, try to contain the strategy. But we also know from the Balkan Wars that once the Western military might does show up, it's often a way of convincing those folks who are behind the guns at the local level to put down their guns and to try to find some sort of broader political settlement. And so we can only hope that as there's intensified pressure that we will get that sort of effort on the ground, because there is no military solution. It has to be a political solution in the end.
But
Alexander, sorry, go ahead, Francisco.
You know, the definition of the military action is political. So we are forgetting that there is political decisions that are made here, and in many other countries to go and implement particular ways than the military participation is done in that particular countries. And that military presence has political effects everywhere. You know, I mean, to separate this of the other one, in my opinion, is not right. So we have to talk about the political concept that we are going to implement through many options: the military option, the humanitarian option, the immigration process, the refugee process, the bilateral relationship with countries, peace talks, name it. So it's not possible just to isolate one element and say if that's right or wrong, is a military solution or not, because it's not. Never have been totally a military solution in any of the conflicts lately after the Second World War.
Let me put a new issue on the table here, which is the power of the picture. And I can't recall a story in my lifetime where a single image has had the power to galvanize people and to change. Well, hang on. I mean, wait for me to finish the sentence, because what I was going to say is more than television. There have been television images in the past that have galvanized populations, but images, still pictures. You've all seen the picture of that poor child, 3-year-old, with his face down in the water. I'm not going to show that one again. Here are some other pictures, though, that maybe you haven't seen. These are from Budapest, Hungary. Asylum seekers, refugees, call them what you want, at a railway station near Budapest. We've got a series of 3 here that we can show. And those, you have seen those confrontations on television between the military personnel who are trying to keep people out of Hungary, and wow, look at the people trying to flee danger and come to Europe and to a more sane situation. Those pictures tell part of the story, Alexander. They don't tell the whole story. So again, based on your work, what are conditions like for asylum seekers now in Europe?
Obviously, with just so many people and the movement of people, it's very difficult. I think that if you can make it without, unfortunately, perishing on sea, which is what a lot of people do, a lot of unreported deaths at sea, still trying to get through all these different countries, and you're crossing borders, which, you know, when you're fleeing, you don't worry about. But obviously, those countries are trying to protect those borders. That's what we saw with Hungary being as difficult as they've been, because they're trying to get to Germany. But then once they get to Germany, there are just so many people. How do you deal with that many bodies, that many people who need asylum, that many people who need to go through a claim process?
Although, what the Deputy Prime Minister of Germany said the other day, we could take 800,000 a year for years to come.
That would be wonderful. I think that they should be, and they should be encouraging other EU countries, but just what's the arrival versus the actual being able to integrate? That sometimes can be, people get there, they're safe, but then how quickly can they integrate and start their lives over again?
Let's state the obvious here, Christian. Is there any question in your mind that things are better for migrants when they arrive in a Western country, even if it's difficult, than where they came from? Is that obvious to say?
Well, the difficulty of the journey shows us just how terrible conditions are where people are leaving. And those are the pictures that we're not talking about. The 2 million people who've left for Turkey, the million who are in Lebanon, a country half the size of Hungary, the 600,000 in Jordan, the World Food Organization that last week had to stop feeding a third of those people because there's not enough money to go around to buy food for them. So just how desperate those circumstances are. And so while I feel for the refugees that are making their way to Europe, it's the frail, the olds, the mothers, the children. By and large, what we see is 75% men, and of those, they largely tend to be young men. And so we need to make sure we also have a balanced response to this crisis, not just one that focuses, that's driven by the psychological effect of a picture of a 3-year-old dead child on a beach.
Janice.
So just to follow on, Steve, the people who are moving right now are the healthiest, the best equipped, the youngest to undertake an arduous journey. And we have to see that. Left behind in the country, either as displaced people or in refugee camps, are older people, women, children. And if we just stop for 1 second and on the fact that Christian just mentioned, the World Food Program had to stop feeding these people in refugee camps because countries like ours are not giving enough money.
So that's one thing we could do right away.
That is astounding to me. And that's not to diminish the important work that Alexandra's doing in galvanizing this country to sponsor refugee families. But an immediate need is to provide minimal rations, food, and clean drinking water in refugee camps. And governments, they are short 2/3. That's an immediate thing we could do.
Francisco. But also, you see the large number of people are men, because in the civil war are fight in the vast majority by young men. And they are forced recruited. They are escaping for forced recruitment, for violence, for many things. The people that are killed first in these conflicts are young men. So in that case, the push factor is there. So, and the gender component, we have to analyze it in that particular way. Of course, we have to have special policies and programs to try to help the people that don't have the energy, don't have the money, don't have the resources to escape from that particular situation. Of course we have, but we have to have a holistic approach. This is a civil war, this is a society that is in the run, and run everybody. And who runs better, you know, who runs, yeah, exactly.
But let's not diminish the fact that we also are aware that sometimes only one family member can make the trip.
Exactly.
Right. And sometimes you send the strongest person out there to try and help I mean, that's what the Kurdi family said, that the one older brother went with the hopes that he could bring the rest of his family later on, because those vulnerable people can't move.
You need that hawk, you know, in here in the Western.
The pull factor, Steve, that we're beginning to see, which is going to make this even more complicated. In Iraq right now, in areas where the violence is not as intense as in other parts, young men are leaving, they're sending, they choose one family member, the strongest, the one most likely to survive this terrible journey, in the hope that person's going to get asylum, and then be able to sponsor the rest of the family.
How's that going?
Well, you know, it's a terrible process, frankly, and we haven't said much about this, but Europe is disorganized. What was a great asset for Europe, which was an open, unified border area, is a huge liability in this, because they've skewed the system. Right now, the rule is you apply for asylum the first time you cross into Europe. That puts countries like Greece, we don't need to talk about Greece, you know, Hungary, which has, frankly, some of the most anti-immigrant sentiment in all of Europe, right on the front lines. And Chancellor Merkel has been struggling to get the rest of Europe to share the burden. You see the reaction to that, you understand how complicated this process that Alexandra's talking about of integration. There is anti-immigrant sentiment layered over, and let's be candid here, by anti-Muslim sentiment in communities who see them through a very different securitized lens. And that's playing into the politics in a really vicious way.
Christian, let me get you back into this and focus again on Canada. What is it that Canada can or should be doing right now to help this situation?
Well, inherently, this is challenging. The people who say we need to change the rules would also be the first people who would complain if, for instance, someone who had committed a war crime ended up slipping into the country. But it does appear one of the challenges inherently when the federal government goes through a repeated series of cuts, that we have cut some key capacity in many departments, and it would suggest that there might be both a capacity problem and an expertise challenge in terms of trying to speed up this process.
Janice?
So there are obvious things we can do here, Steve. One is that we need to bump up many obvious things. One, bump up our funding of UN agencies that are working with refugees on the ground. That's absolutely critical and urgent. Secondly, we need to deploy teams. The real holdup here is we're in a vicious cycle. We don't accept refugees unless they're UNHCR certified.
Human Rights Commission.
Right, a refugee commission, High Commissioner for Refugees.
High Commissioner for Refugees,
but they won't certify unless we tell them we're going to accept them. We need to put our own teams on the ground, move past these barriers right now, which we can do on an emergency basis, and quadruple the rate at which we're processing refugees in the field. There's no doubt about Canadians' willingness to step up and get engaged here. There are long waiting lists of people for families. The government has to now deploy people, and it can do it, it's done it in the past, to fill out that list.
Does it make it more complicated to do all this, Alexandra, because we're in the middle of an election campaign, and therefore this has become It's a bit of a political.
Less complicated. They should take it off the table.
But it's become a bit of a political football because one side says we're going to do this, and then the other side says, well, we're going to do more, and the third side says we're going to do more, and
the refugees are trapped in the
maybe
center.
We are talking about this because we are in a political campaign. You know, that's something that everybody's using it in a way politically to talk about things.
So if not for the campaign, we might not be talking about this.
Maybe we will be talking in a totally different way. This is a political approach to a very humanitarian crisis. And that's one of the key problems that we have. Everybody's talking about numbers. Everybody's talking about what they are going to do after October. But nobody does anything in this particular time that we need to bring thousands and thousands of people to Canada.
Let me bring some polling data to this, because the Angus Reid Institute surveyed Canadians on what Canadians thought ought to be done right now. Can we bring this chart up here? What can Canada do? 90% of the people surveyed have some awareness of the issue, which is a very high number. Yes. So people know there's a problem. 64% even say they're following it very closely. 70% say Canada has a role to play. Okay, with all of that in place, what do? 76% say Canada should send nurses, doctors, armed forces, etc., and get involved. 63% say Canadian individuals and organizations should sponsor more refugees. 64% say the Canadian government should take in more refugees. Now here's where it gets more complicated. 44% say we should offer financial support to Europe, but we should not take in more refugees. 23% say we should do nothing. My first question, Alexander, is what do you think about the 23% who say we should do nothing?
Well, I have to assume that they don't understand that we're in a global world and we're all affected by what happens overseas. Even though it might seem very far away, obviously we're affected by the refugees. Leaving aside Canada's long history of being a humanitarian country that should provide support just because we are, as Canadians, feel that's our role, I think that people have to understand that what happens in the Middle East has a direct impact on our country as well.
Christian, it may be possible that some of that 23% feel that we don't know anything about these refugees, and who knows how many potential terrorists are hiding among them, and that's why they don't want them coming to our shores. Is that possible?
Well, I think they sort of pretend that we live in sort of a geostrategic isolation and we can just kind of shut down our borders. And I think these knock-on effects are really important, and to understand that the Lebanese civil war took 15 years and the Syrian civil war, who knows how long this particular conflict is going to take given the strategic importance. And as we see in your charts, the growing number of internally displaced people that then putting pressure on the refugee camps, these flows are not about to stop. And so we need certainly a multi-tier sustained response to this that goes from everything on the ground that Jan has mentioned to here in Canada, trying to see what we can do to do this also responsibly, to make sure that we try to resettle people who already have connections, because we know from research that they integrate better and they establish themselves better. But we also, I think, need to be aware that Canada already has the highest legal per capita immigration of any country in the world. And so that Canada already does a substantial share, over 250,000 people a year coming to this country, in trying to make sure that it does have an approach to those individuals who do wish to come to Canada. It's in the top 3 countries in terms of UNHCR resettlement. So Canada does play its share, but the question is, of course, in this sort of a crisis, there is likely potential to do more based both on our population base and our economic capacity.
Let me go to Francisco with the follow-up. You made the distinction of immigration versus refugees. They are 2 different streams of people. If we open the doors to assist the crisis that everybody agrees is happening right now for refugees, do we run the risk of upsetting or creating a double standard for immigrants, some of whom have waited a very long time to come in and are taking their time to do so?
Well, have been the opposite. Many refugees, then they are very qualified immigrants. They have chosen to do in the immigration program and come to Canada due to risk or persecution back home. Many people from many countries have done that. So refugees, we have to keep it for the people that are really in need, then they don't have many other mechanisms or qualifications to come to Canada, and to open up the immigration system.
How many do you think we can take a year? How many refugees?
Well, let me give you my example. 8 years ago, 10 years ago, we were receiving only in the city of Canada, in the city of Toronto, 500 asylum seekers a month. Now, with the refugee reforms, with the changes in all of this process and the complication of this, we don't receive even 250 refugees a month in the city of Toronto. So we have a huge space to take people in the city of Toronto. We have reduced the intake of asylum seekers in Canada 50% in the last 3 or 4 years. So there is an infrastructure that is totally there. You know what I mean? That we can use social services, everything. We have also the whole structure of a settlement organization that have been doing this for years. And now we have all the cities and provinces trying to kick in with civil and social support for the intake or more refugees. Yeah.
So
in that case, we have a capacity for many.
Could we do 10,000 a year?
Sure.
Yeah,
yes.
easily.
Can we do 20,000 a year?
Yeah,
This country has the infrastructure for 50,000 refugees a year.
We did 60 over a year, like a couple of years when we did the Indo-Chinese movement, obviously. And I mean, we're seeing incredible numbers contacting us saying they want to help. When you're having private sponsorship, where it's the civil society that's doing the lion's share of the work, I mean, obviously the settlement agencies need to be there, obviously need the visa posts overseas to process. But then when they get here, the support that they're getting is from the civil society. Why couldn't you tap into that and increase the numbers?
Let me raise one other issue. You know, see, very recently, we all remember the tsunami, and the government stepped up and said it would match donations that civil society put forward. Why isn't there a matching program in a global crisis like this, where for every dollar that civil society is now investing in sponsorship, the government partners? So I really...
You've asked the question. What's the answer?
I don't know. I don't know. But I think it's difficult for me to understand why we can respond in one way to a tsunami, but we cannot respond in another way to the flows of people that we are seeing move right now under terrible, terrible conditions. So I think we have the infrastructure. We're a rich country. Yes. We are one of the world's rich countries, and we have an engaged civil society. We're missing one piece.
How many spare rooms do we have in the city of Toronto or in Canada? Why we don't have a campaign and said, do you have a spare room? Do you want to share it with a Syrian family? And you will see, and you have a public list when people go and register their capacities to take people. And you will see the reaction of Canada. When I came to Canada, they brought me from El Salvador, because I was at risk, to Canada. I am alive because that program, because this courage of the immigration officer going into the country and trying to select people that were at risk, that program is gone. So what is our response to this crisis in the same way? We are not doing it. So in my opinion, Canada can do many things more, and we have the capacity to take as many refugees as we can, 100,000. We can take it. Just take the number of a sponsorship, private sponsorship place that the people has. More than 30,000 already. You know, that's the capacity, and you can double that one if you take the POP, you know, and said every parish has to take a family, and if you take every church in a local basis has to take a family, every union has to take a family, every school can take a family. You can open up, and we can bring thousands and thousands of refugees. The issue is not that. The civil society is ready to take it, though.
I'm going to ask Christian a very blunt question. Are we not doing that because these people are Muslims?
I think what we are seeing is a very different response in Canada than what we see in Germany. In Germany, we had an executive decision by the political executive at the federal level that is now being imposed on the states and on the cities. And we see pushback from North Rhine-Westphalia. The premier, for instance, Hannelore Kraft, complaining quite explicitly about not enough support from the federal government and the immense numbers of people that they are required to take on the distribution system. And so what we see, I think, in Canada is more of a bottom-up measure, where we need to make sure that cities and provinces are on board, that they put forward the numbers that they think they have the capacity to fund and to deal with and to cope with and to integrate. And from that, then the federal government, I think, can generate a target. And I do think that while there are certain ethnic groups that do drive certain constituencies, particularly in Montreal and in Toronto, in this particular case, the Syrian constituency is not strong enough to drive the political elements. And yet I think we're a diverse country, and we don't have a past history of at least not a recent past history of discriminating on religious or ethnic backgrounds, say in the last 60 or so years. And so I'm confident that religion is not what is the main decision-making driver here.
All right, let me ask Janice the more sort of generous question here. When Francisco came here, a third, if not more, of Canada was Catholic.
Yeah.
So he was not considered, quote unquote, the other.
No.
What's the Muslim population of Canada? 1 or 2%?
Yes.
So
is that
a problem?
Yes. So to be blunt, I don't think there's any doubt that that is playing into this and exacerbating this crisis. And that's what I said earlier. It is tied up with security issues. A lot of the discussion of processing is around a level of screening that people in El Salvador were never subjected to. And again, I think this is something we have to face squarely and honestly and rise above, frankly. There are solutions to all these problems that really devolve around sending our own people into the field, connecting refugee families to families that are already here. It would not, we have to admit that this is a factor, face ourselves and say we need to rise above this. Because, by the way, the same things were said about Hungarian refugees. There was a real fear that Hungarian refugees would embed in them communist spies. There were issues with the Vietnamese boat people. There were security issues around that. We just forget those discussions. There have always been security fears, but governments rose above it and managed it.
How often do those fears end up coming true?
We have to face the fact that we may make a mistake. I think that's honest with the Canadian public, that a mistake may occur, and if that mistake occurs, that does not invalidate both the obligation and the desire of the Canadian public to run the risk of that mistake in order to take another 50,000 people who will become productive citizens in this country and enrich the country.
So, Alexandra, how well are we doing right now living up to our long-standing reputation as being a safe harbor when things go south?
Oh, not particularly well. I mean, the most number I've heard of Syrians arriving is 250. 2,500. And when you look at the number of people that are interested in sponsoring, when you look at the cases that are overseas, because we know that there's wait times of 6 months to a year and a half for people to arrive in Canada. That's for families that have put cases in, friends here, sponsoring groups, churches, unions, all these people who are desperate to welcome these people. And they're not arriving, and our overall commitment at this point from our government is only 10,000 over the next 3 years. That's crazy amounts of that's not enough, really.
And Francisco, last word to you. Those who still have distrust for this situation, what do you want to say to them?
This country changed people. You know, when I came to Canada, I was part of a civil war. The violence was surrounding me. I didn't know if I am going to go back to my house alive. My kids were threatened. My friends were kidnapped. My friends were killed. Look who I am. A very peaceful person, trying to do as best as I can to help this country to react to situations like I faced when I was young. So I think the person deserves a chance. And it's not possible to say, you were this and this, you don't have a chance. Give them a chance, and they will prove me right every single time. I work with those people. I work with refugees. I work with people that have been accused of many things. Let them a chance, and they will build this country way much better.
Francisco, you get the last word. Good words, if I may say. Christian Leuprecht, we thank you for being there for us. On the line from Kingston, Ontario, Janice Stein here in our studio, Francisco Rico Martinez, and Alexandra Kotick. Thanks so much, everybody.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.